I want to start by thanking Heather and the conference organizers and all of you for gathering here. It feels appropriate to start by calling on the muses as we gather together to embark on this week of exploring such a magnificent range of topics surrounding what I believe is one of the more important threads of ancient Greek philosophy: music. I'll focus on giving some of the broader views and then zoom in on the details of what I take to be Archytas and Aristoxenus' greatest contributions, and we will see if the muses might help us along the way. Although Aristoxenus, in proper peripatetic fashion, appears to have naturalized and demystified the muses. But we will get to that later. Let me set the stage for you. Archytas was decisive in the progress of ancient musicology, giving a mix of mathematical, theoretical, and technical insights with philosophical depth that had impact that cascaded across Plato's Republic, Phaedo, Timaeus, and then reconfigured in Aristotle's Metaphysics and Politics. It is with the delightful peripatetic text Problemata 19 on harmony that the field of musicology begins and is finally rendered in a formula by Theophrastus, saying that the nature of music is, quote, the movement of the soul that occurs with a view to release from the evils due to the emotions, end quote. This opened the way for Aristoxenus to make an artistic know-how as a purely musical expertise. The study of music involves what we might today think of as something like Gestalt psychology or a phenomenological investigation of musical perception. Musical form is understood as operating with a mood-mode parallelism. We have this today. Minor is considered sad. Major is happy. And these descriptions are helpful for a novice musician, but are crude and wildly inaccurate if taken as absolutes. You can make joyful music in minor keys and the most agonizing laments in major. Chopin has many mournful pieces in major keys. Half of his funeral march is in a major tonality. But this does not disprove the parallelism of mood and mode. It only demands that we investigate it more deeply and come up with new concepts which are adequate to the particulars. This is what Archytas did by calculating the diverse attunements used by practicing musicians. A sad major will always have different types of sadness than a sad minor piece. This whole discussion immediately forces us to reflect on the complexity of emotions and habituation, which is why it was so central to both Plato and Aristotle. A central feature of their music was modulation. Musicians seem to have been changing not only the scale and key multiple times in a single song, but also making small tuning variations, harmonic, which further modifies the character of a melody. As we will see, the modern notion of modal was, in Greek, called tonoi or harmoniae and harmosmena. Each term refers to a variety of music forms, such as rhythm, melody, style, as well as the meaning, the effort, the intention, the temperament, the tenor, the attunement, with a variety of aesthetic and moral connotations therein. Both Archytas and Aristoxenus were decidedly empiricist, and perhaps above all were inventors. To them, harmony and music were not already existing things that we simply trace, but like forms which can take on an infinity of different appearances, were the seeds of unforeseeable growths and movements to be playfully created by a devoted practitioner. So I will start by discussing the musical and technical insights of Archytas and link them to Socrates' musical psychology, and then I'll briefly situate Aristoxenus' profound innovations in musical theory and phenomenology of music making in his study of melody. So where Pythagoras had measured the simplest diatonic tuning, what we today call three-limit just intonation, and perhaps he even merely receives this from earlier Babylonian sources, but at any rate, Archytas went much further and gave us the oldest mathematical description of the three genera, the diatonic, and harmonic, and the chromatic, and established for us a clear understanding of the complex microtonal modulations that ancient musicians had devised by ear using the harmonic overtones, and referred to by Socrates in Republic 3 as the Soph or the tense Lydian. This refers to what we today know as 7-limit just intonation, which is based on the 7th harmonic of the harmonic series. These are the classifications of intervals of the harmonic series determined always by the highest prime factor used in the tuning system. So Ptolemy records for us 3-limit, 5-limit, 7-limit, 11-limit, and 19-limit tunings. Archytas' soft diatonic is formed by basically detuning one of the strings, the parapate, the second lowest to the bottom. You go down this little amount, which creates this smaller semitone of 28 over 27. We can understand this interval as being found between the 28th and 27th harmonics of the harmonic series. 27, is 9 times 3. And so it is a composite of the fifth, which is 3 over 2, and the whole tone, which is 9 over 8. 27 to 16, the 27th harmonic, forms an interval with the next harmonic, the 28th, 28 over 16, and 28 over 16 reduces to 7 over 4. So his tetrachord has the following ratio: 27, 28, 32, 36. These numbers can be separated and given the same denominator, 27, to get 27 over 27, reducible to 1 over 1, a unison. 28 over 27, semitone. 32 over 27, Pythagorean minor third. 36 over 27, which reduces to 4 over 3, a perfect fourth. And then we would double this as a second tetrachord, starting a whole tone above these notes. This 9 over 8 above it. And that's the bare bones of this tuning. Let's see how he achieves it and attempt to understand the mathematics. The tetrachord of Archytas is a set of intervals found in the harmonic series based on the 6, 7, 8 ratio, that is, between the 6th, 7th, and 8th harmonics. It can be understood through the procedure of stacking particular intervals, in this case, perfect fourths, which have a septimal minor within them, creating a triad. Now, Archytas gives us some tools to help this all make sense. As evidenced in Fragment 2, Archytas is attributed with providing 3 main classes of musical intervals: geometrical, arithmetic, and harmonic. They, in fact, occur in this exact order within the harmonic series. We can thus reconstruct Archytas' pyramid by dividing the octave into its arithmetic and harmonic components. Here it is represented with a rough representation of the scaling of these means as decreasing interval sizes. And here it is stretched out in a linear tonal space spanning over 2 octaves. If we isolate the third triad in this series here, this is the harmonic series, which is a perfect fourth divided by the septimal minor third, 7 over 6, We can use this triad to generate Archytas diatonic by simply stacking these triads. Then we must octave reduce to get the scalar form. While this method of scale generation works logically, it is not the practical method of tuning, which is actually much easier to do by ear than all of this. It is not difficult to modulate from Archytas soft diatonic to the chromatic and enharmonic genera. All we need to do is detune the licanos and paranete, either using the consonances in the case of the chromatic, or by means of the fifth harmonic in the enharmonic genus, and we will have used the seventh harmonic to achieve Archytas diatonic semitone of 28/27. So let me say a few more general things about harmony in order to fully unpack Archytas tuning. First and perhaps most unique interval of the harmonic series are the subset of the geometric series, which has the familiar and recognizable pattern 1 to 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, etc. We all remember it from Nintendo and USB sticks. Musically, this pattern is perceived as the series of ascending or descending octave divisions and multiplications. The octave has the unique musical quality of an equivalence, but with a contrast, felt as a kind of difference of tension or as a distance and elevation and depth, height, higher, lower, sharper, deeper. The ancient Greek philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians were in awe of the geometric series, this process of doubling, and its pervasiveness and fundamentality in music. The geometric series is only a small subset of the intervals of the harmonic series. The prime series has its own unique mode of generation, and this corresponds to a different set of musical functions. Where every octave has equivalence, the primes have complex differences. We must think qualitatively of the relation between, for example, 3 and 7. This relation generates the intervallic structure and the unique set of tonal colors of Archytas diatonic. 5 and 7 have their own complex relation that is markedly different in emotional tone. Each is more suitable to certain melodies. When we get higher in the prime series, we find more and more dissonant sounding intervals. 5, 7, 11, 13. There are also many overtones in the harmonic series, which are the compound of earlier intervals. The 15th harmonic, for example, 15/8, is a unique sounding note, but is also the product of 3 to 2 and a major third of 5 to 4. And since 5 times 3 is 15. So harmonics come in 3 main varieties: geometric, compound, such as 9/8, 15/8, 27/16, 45/32, and primes, which use the numbers 3, 5, 7, 11, etc. Technically, every interval of the harmonic series is unique, even octaves. Even a unison makes a difference, according to peripatetics. Theophrastus calls this the idiotes, the singular quality, which has a unique dunamis based on its relationship with other tones. This is the basis of forming any sistema, a unique attunement derived from the ordering of certain consonances and dissonances found in the acoustic and harmonic phenomena. But each one involves a selection and fitting together of these intervals. That is the work of harmony. Different ancient cultures developed unique styles, and this influenced the modes they were most associated with. No doubt, musicians everywhere were switching between each mode and switching between different styles. This is taken to the extreme with national anthems and state control of the arts, where a mode is made the object of censorship. Certainly, musicians have historically continued to discover new musical potentials, and while the majority of music today is cliché and redundant, something AI quickly mastered, for humans, music has a spiritual dimension. When engaged passionately, it always involves an element of invention, creativity, gestural expression, and style. And each mode really does have a unique feel to it, and of course there is a latitude of what you can do expressively with it. It's not like it makes one feeling happy or sad or something like that. But, the Lydian is very light and very airy and fluid and soft, and it easily modulates into other keys. It's a very unstable key. And when we compare it to the minor or even the Phrygian, we can feel how much different just immediately that modulation creates. And here we can play again the Mixolydian and the major. And each one really has its own unique characteristics to it, and you can tell that it would create melodies of a certain feeling. No musician invented melody or created our ability to be melodious. It is melodiousness which affords us the opportunity to be inventive and develop our style. This is what Aristoxenus will tell us, as we'll see. And there are actually many other intervals in the harmonic series beyond these three categories, such as if we take two consecutive intervals in compound. This is what happens when we remove the fundamental tone and listen to only two of the prime intervals. We will find so much beautiful and unique dissonances. And this is what the ancient Greek harmony used to be more emotive. This beautiful little semitone of Archytas also makes the 14/9 minor sixth a very emotional and delicate and soft and heartfelt sixth. When we play this in a Lydian mode, we get a very spaced out and relaxed feeling scale, something very at ease. The names used in the ancient Greek modes are mostly not the same as the medieval names, which we use today. The Lydian is the only Greek mode that maintains its original naming. We think about the modes and scales differently than they did. We represent the starting and ending notes as the tonic or fundamental, while for the ancient Greeks, the middle note, meze, functioned musically as the tonal center. The peripatetic Problemata on harmony tells us that melodies would go up and down while returning frequently to the middle note, meze, and this is how the modes have been deduced in the extant musical fragments like the 2nd century BC hymns to Apollo or the Syracusa epitaph. We don't know which attunements these compositions were played in. Perhaps they were modulating between attunements. Maybe they were all in the simpler Pythagorean 3 limit? We can't say. There are reasons to believe, perhaps, that the complex microtonality of more ancient musical forms had fallen out of practice by the 2nd century, but at any rate, they never died out entirely and are finally preserved by 2nd century AD polymath musicologist Claudius Ptolemy of Alexandria, who admits that no one really knew for sure how to play the ancient genera, the enharmonic and the chromatic. Here's what those dense notes sound like. Likely they are a tuning or scale that musicians would modulate to in the flow of songs that started in a diatonic mode. Going from diatonic to enharmonic would have an intense effect on the quality of the melody. It is likely that they tuned some harps to have 15 or more strings per octave, allowing for very complex, but often quite musically expressive modulations. The ulos, with its wide range of note bending through both the embouchure and the partial hole coverings, can easily play the enharmonic puknon. It is also entirely possible that 7 and 8-string lyres were tuned directly to the enharmonic and played in it without modulating. We truly cannot say for sure, but the Athenian national anthem was reported to be sung in the enharmonic genus. What we do know with certainty is that the differences in genus, as well as in attunement, provided unique expressive potentiality for melody making. In lieu of the limitations of ancient Greek polyphony, by which I mean a fairly limited set of instruments and apparently fairly minimal mixing of instruments in concert. Certainly there were concerts with lyre, kithara, ulos, and commonly matched with voices and drums, but it is unknown how much harmonizing was done beyond 3 consonances, or even 2 voices moving in counterpoint. This is in fact possible on the ulos itself, as it is a 2-voiced instrument. It lends itself to independent movements in each hand. I, for one, would be surprised if musicians weren't at least weaving together 2-part counterpunctal melodies, or at least a sort of choral form, i.e., relatively independence of bass, rhythm, and melody. As I said, there's no evidence of this I'm aware of. It's a hunch as a musician. The tendency of musicians to look for something contrasting but also agreeing with other musical elements is so natural. Just as it's unlikely the drum hits were only at the exact rhythmic pattern of the poetic meter, so it's unlikely that the drum always remained in the same rhythm as the melody. Part of the reason scholars are skeptical about ancient polyphony is that the modern musicology created a false narrative of progress in which the ancient Greeks were in a musical Stone Age compared to European Renaissance, and that more generally music was harmonically extremely simple for thousands of years, and then suddenly it evolved by orders of magnitude into Bach. Even Schoenberg echoes this myth, but he provides the minimal transparency of admitting that this was only a nursery rhyme. No doubt, the symphonies were feats of technological development in an extreme, diverse timbre palette. What the modern European symphony gained in establishing concert pitch, getting all the instruments to play together in the same key. Most instruments are in different keys, and to play them all together and to modulate between different keys took centuries to develop. Horn players would switch between an A and a D and an E-flat instrument. Later, valves and slides and frets, and all of that allowed for 12 equally tempered tones to become the superstructure of concert pitch and make every modulation identical. In the Renaissance and in modern music, each key had a unique flavor because the tunings approximated the just intervals of the harmonic series, which are unequal. When Chopin put his piece in a key with accidentals like F sharp, or B flat, it is because that key had a unique character and charm, which he knew how to draw a new emotion out of. At the end of the 19th century, brought the close to harmonic diversity and experimentation with tempering. Whether or not ancient musicians composed or improvised polyvocal arrangements, I think it's fair to say that they made their most profound development in the area of expressive soloing, in which voice or ulos would modulate freely between microtonal scales, as with Middle Eastern maqam and North Indian raga music. Subtle intonation differences in tone, voice, or in voice with strings. It's certainly minimalist in composition, but was no less elevated and vast in its expressive potential, as it is intense and deep in its affective power. In a word, their music was as moving as ours is. That's hard to prove, but I believe it's true. Probably Neanderthal music was moving. We are not much more intelligent than them. And if anything, it's likely that our hearts have closed and grown colder than those prehistoric peoples. Hesiod claimed as much in his own time. The beautiful song comes from those golden-souled daimon ancestors who inspire us. For Aristoxenus, this daimon muse becomes melodiousness as an element of nature with its own essence. And while our songs each have, unique sound patterns, they all participate in this nature of melody. This nature is a being in its own right, not reducible to the mind or the soul, nor to physical movements or numbers. If the prehistoric ancients had better forms of music, as nearly every ancient author claimed, it was because they had a closer relationship to this elemental potential found in nature. Now, out of the vast modulatory potential of melodiousness in itself, we find traces of structure that maintain a certain musical function and tie the melody to a certain tonality. These are variously referred to as Tonos, Harmonia, and Harmosmenon. Tonos, when used in non-musical contexts, means effort, psychical tension, and everything related to attitude, attention, and intention. This is not merely a verbal ambiguity of unrelated equivocations, but is a clever insight into a profound analogy with the continuity of modes and moods. The composer switches from a major to a minor scale to shift and shape the emotional quality. They would switch between an intense or a relaxed attunement, or to another genre, to create contrasts and new emotions. Tonos includes but is not limited to the scale, the key, the pitch, but also the style of the melody or the feel of the rhythm. Harmonia further augments this meaning cluster by not only functioning as a synonym for tonos, for scale and style, but also it brings in a sense of fitting together, which was found in carpentry. It names a complex unity greater than the sum of the parts, formed by connecting relations without homogenizing contrasts. Today we tend to think of harmony as something pre-established in nature, while in the Greeks the word referred more to the act of tuning tones to each other, fitting them together with almost a kind of tinkering. Harmony is an immediate contrast, apparent without external mediation, that blends into an indivisible whole without leveling the differences among the ingredients. The basic consonances form a superstructure for melodic expression. Dissonance never fully blends in, and contrast predominates in the sensation. The strings on the harp are in tune with each other, but each has its own unique pitch and tone. Furthermore, each position in the scale can serve as the key center, whereby it becomes the reference point from which the rest of the notes are arranged and contextualized musically. This is modal modulation. Harmonia as symphonia implies that a plurality of voices sing together and form one communal activity. The multitude of pitches in a chord form a whole. The nuances of vibration, of variation, of volume, emphasis, and timbre, all the subtle details coalesce to form the style and overall feeling of the performance. In harmony, multiplicity fits together in a complex and concrete unity. Modulation next. When learning to play different attunements, as found in both the modulations between tonal centers and even more so in the methods of microtuning, it is never enough for one to simply learn to play and memorize scales. We must also learn how to play them musically. In a similar manner, the art of orchestration draws more out of the melody by selecting the instrumentation which best exaggerates and enhances the intended feelings. We can go a step further and fine-tune each scale, making it be more in tune with the song. The melody is attuned to the tuning when it becomes more expressive of the attitude and the style of the melody. By analogy, the philosopher must do more than engage in arguments and explanations. There are attunements of the psyche, attitudes, passions, temperaments, and the influence of these makes or breaks the philosophical viability of thinking and discourse, according to Socrates. Along with thinking, we need a philosophical temperament, a tenor, and an expertise, a spirit of fairness, a yearning for truth, the courage to admit our errors, to confront our ignorance, and to work in open dialogue with others. The phenomenological attitude is the core truth of phenomenology, that we can cultivate it and that our effort actually gets us somewhere. Philosophical discourse provides an occasion to collectively work together to better attune ourselves to one another and to the work of philosophy. Philosophy has the dual task of modulating the attunement of consciousness, but also of understanding these changes of attunement. Socrates gets the unphilosophical Glaucon to agree to outlaw Archytas tuning, which is a soft diatonic. Perhaps the relaxed Lydian is not suitable for heroes and warriors off to battle, but it was most likely useful for philosophers as a medicine. This is how the later Neoplatonic tradition understood Pythagoras' achievement as a musical healer, that he, like Orpheus, could easily charm people's souls and make them feel whatever he chose, and that he benevolently conspired to facilitate their flourishing. Aristotle defends the use of Lydian and other modulations as having cathartic and spiritual potential. Now, no musician invented melodiousness. It's a potential immanent to nature. The composer invents a way of being melodious, but it is melodiousness which affords musicians the opportunity to be inventive and develop stylistically. Here is where the novelty and ingenuity of Aristoxenus is most pronounced. The vast attunement potential of harmonics, all these unique intervals, this multiplicity of systems, is useful to the musician, not as explained in theoretical concepts, nor even the scientific program for producing knowledge. It is useful to the musician on the level of the sensation of tone. The diversity of sensations have a different but noble contribution to the development of virtue. This virtue that is the excellence and expertise of musicianship. When a musician follows the feeling of the melody, they also perceive the shifting potentials of the notes as they vary in the musical context. A primary task of studying music is investigating what is melodic in every given context. Aristoxenus recognized and sought to explain the profound capacity of certain musicians to transcend all musical systems while remaining melodic and musical. This type of musicianship could describe moments in Bach or Chopin, and much more so Debussy or Fauré. Frequent modulation has become common practice in contemporary film music, since it produces an abrupt change of atmosphere. Jazz takes the fluidity of tonal centering as far as it can go, and keeps going. What I am describing is modulation, the change of the steady scalar structure potentiating the melody. This can be unmelodic, such as in atonal music. This music subverts the nature of melody, sticks to the unmelodic in order to prevent melodic continuity. The musicality of atonality in Schoenberg was evidence of his organic view of musical composition, useful, he thought, for determining the nature of music itself. Atonal, unmelodic music can still elicit complex emotional depth, and thus is an evolution of musical content like developing variation itself. Developing variation is a term Schoenberg coined to describe the transformational and developmental aspects of complex music. Everything grows from one or a few small, relatively simple motives that take on 1,000 disguises, serve very different formal and harmonic functions, and repeat with a totally different feel. But it is indeed repeating certain formal similarities in completely new ways. This method of composition, which prioritizes what we could call differential repetition, maintains the continuity of a music that changes at every moment. Quite different sounding themes can be developed from the same motives. The motive is, of course, this smaller patterning or something, which undergoes variations. The motive itself is less one single pattern than a latitude of patterns varying on multiple vectors within certain limits. Aristoxenus is very close to Schoenberg without, I think, the latter having any influence from the former. It's the continuity of variation within musical form that reveals the nature of music and shows that it has an organic form of its own that is irreducible to either the physical sounds nor to our imagination's addition to them. Music exists between the physical and psychical. We perceive sounds musically only after we habituate our senses to perceiving them. Only then can we participate in and interpret their beautiful and intricate patterning. Following the potential of the tones, musicians move freely in a nonlinear melodic modulation, proving the melodiousness transcends the elements that participate in it, that it is an independent reality, but that it also is immanent to the cosmos. All right, I'm going to go back through all of what I just said there about Aristoxenus and then reconnect it to Schoenberg and Merleau-Ponty, but first I want to introduce Aristoxenus and unpack his contributions more carefully. Aristoxenus established a science of musicality, melodiousness, as a unique object of knowledge with its own inner logic. This knowledge is not conceptual or representational, but arises on the level of trained perception. Perception is not, for Aristoxenus, simply a faculty receptive of information, but a process in which the faculty is actively engaged in enriching the perception, bringing its perception into clarity and vividness. Ear training indeed brings about an unparalleled skill for singers and instrumentalists. His approach mixes phenomenological descriptions of musical perception with musical expertise. He tells us that the comprehension of music, zoonesis, is due to the activity of sense perception and memory. Quote, we perceive the sound that is coming to be and remember that which is past. In no other way can we closely attend to the music. End quote. This involves both hearing and thinking, so that by the former, we discern the magnitude of the interval, by the latter, we contemplate the function of the note. End quote. As Stauffer explains, quote, the nature and value of music for Aristoxenus lies in the conscious perception of its sonorous pattern, not in the sonorieties themselves. End quote. But this does not mean that it is purely cerebral or that it leads to a general concept or proposition. Music is a pre-linguistic cognition. The perceptive faculty of judgment itself, the common sense, must be trained, developing it to discern well. In this sense, musical knowledge will remain tethered to the arts as something which we have an expertise, pragmatuentai, rather than a strict conceptual knowledge of. Music is a skillful movement of tones and rhythms, working in an orderly way with a view to release from pain. To understand music, we must understand the undulating movements of our emotions and aspirations as we passionately perform a melody. We learn which notes have what function musically by playing them, and not merely by learning the scales and abstraction. The fact that modulations can be done melodically shows us that musical potential of each note goes beyond one system and one given pattern of intervals. Aristoxenus is a realist when it comes to music. Music is a reality in its own right, with a nature and an inner source of its being, affections, and the modes of its becoming. Melodiousness is not reducible to any other reality such as physical sounds, numerical relations, or to something that the soul projects into the sounds. It's not a synthesis accomplished by the mind, not merely the product of human agency. Melodiousness produces musical continuity, whereby sound patterning is felt and interpreted according to an immanent logic of the sounds as complexly related potentialities, what he calls the dunamis. Melodic series always involve certain fixed relation among the notes. This is determined by the relative function that the notes have in certain musical contexts. The same three notes have very different functions when put in a different order or played against a different tonic. Essentially, Aristoxenus attempts to study the logic of functional harmony in a purely musicological way, looking to find what works musically and what does not. Aristoxenus employed an empirical method of observation to understand melody, without treating its data as an object external to the soul, something measured or schematized. Instead of musicology as an abstract theory, it is something that is enacted and gradually perfected through learning and practice. He calls it pragmateia rather than episteme, since it implies the concrete activity of a praxis of playing, what is known to be possible to play musically. It is an aesthetic know-how of effectively moving through harmonically expressive patterns. Aristoxenus also used the middle voice verb pragmatuesthai to refer to this active initiative undertaken by the musician to maintain and develop melodic movement. Melody and song are enacted concretely with expertise and passion. They are known intimately, but in the hands or in the voice itself. The expert must marshal all of the movements of tone, the musical changes of place that melodiousness affords. Rather than considering certain tunings as precisely determined values, Aristoxenus pushed us to think instead of a certain region for each note, topos. This latitude of the interval implies small intonation adjustments, which will render the same basic melodic pattern under various shadings or colorings, chroma. Some will be brighter or tenser, others darker or more relaxed, just as the pure major third can be stretched from 5/4 to 81/61, the Pythagorean ditone. And they generally will sound the same in a melodic series because a scale can be varied by minute microtonal adjustments, chroma, affecting its emotional tone but not altering its recognizable melodic pattern. So the attunement modulations between soft, tonic, and tense diatonic scales that we discussed earlier can be judged by perception and switched between on the fly. Measuring them does not help us feel their musical potential. Aristoxenus rails against the method of katapuknosis for making densely packed diagrams of diesis, these intervals less than a quarter tone. It's always the larger region, the topoi, of the note that ultimately explains the musical organization of notes. Aristoxenus' theory of topoi make the accuracy of the voiced sounds not merely tied to the justly tuned intervals, but being chosen from a variety of microtonal variations, which each involves its own unique coloring. The musician uses this modification as an expressive technique in performing a melody. Musical training will, by intensifying the activity of the common sense, develop the soul's power and enable it to execute more accurate discernment. Melody is something enacted or performed, and likewise, the study of music requires proficiency in concrete actions, such as playing in different modes, which means connecting the notes in certain patterns. This is less a matter of judging which are good or bad note combinations, but rather of understanding the musical function of several different possible melodic movements that the musician has at their disposal at any given moment in the performance. For example, playing in a given mode, a movement across 3 notes will create a unique context for the 4th. The listener is primed by what has just previously been heard and made to anticipate certain movements that will follow. The composer will choose the note that comes next by their musical know-how. They feel what is unique to the function of the note in this context and have chosen it because it answers the call of melodiousness in the context of the preceding movements. The dunamis of the tone is not only the product of its immediate context, but is also a potency to alter that context by both establishing a new context for the next moment, as well as by modulating away from the scalar structure or attunement of what came before. The background from which the figure of the melody emerges, the priming from which its sense emerges, is the nature of melody itself. Just as the soul emerges from the diffuse world soul, so music emerges from the whole psychocosmic potential to connect and disconnect and move within fixed reference frames, as well as establishing new reference frames in which new movements are perceived. This is not a panoptic reference point, a God monad, but rather the transition synthesis that implies, offers, but never guarantees that we can change our reference frame, that we can modulate to another key. It is the possibility of modulation, the changing of the vibe and the mood. By establishing a perceptual gestalt that we, as active listeners, modulate our attention to, we tune into the unique form of playful expression that the melody embodies. By training our perceptual activity and modulating our attention to the unique melodic logic of the song, we draw more out of that experience than it contains, more than it presents as a momentary sensory content by participating in its musicality. The nature of melody is not a static structure or scalar space, but is like the cosmic background, this ever-priming context in which it makes sense to make music and enjoy music, and by which there always is an implicit suggestion of the possibility of making very different sounding music in innumerable other musical contexts. It is an inexhaustible fountain of possibility, which we can make use of in the form of scales or to modulate to another scale while still remaining musical. The dunamis of the note interweaves in a non-linear scalar space which can dilate and contract to create musically diverse reference frames. Aristoxenus' explanations of the nature of melody turn into a proto-phenomenology, describing how intentionality produces the continuity of musical expression. Insofar as melody is something that is produced gradually through a succession of pitches, Aristoxenus says, it is continuous in the same way speech is. That is, by growing the whole from a series of movements following a sort of natural law. Speech uses changes of pitch semantically, like raising pitch signifies a question, but it does not involve deliberately holding pitches. Speech fluctuates in pitch continuously, and if one holds a pitch, the utterance becomes chanting or singing. The continuity by natural law in speech is not in the sounds, in the syllables, but is rather what it comes from the meaning being expressed in the sentence and the continuity of intentionality. The music, the natural continuity, or better, the source of melodic continuity, phusis, is the very emotions and attitudes motivating the acts of expression and that the sounds evoke or express. Aristoxenus explains the way in which we investigate the particular form of continuity which defines melodic expression. Quote, it is not that one needs to pay attention to intervals coming to be from equal or unequal magnitudes in order to understand the nature of continuity, but to pay attention to the growth, the phusis of melody, and one must attempt to attentively observe katanoen and exert oneself enthusiastically prothumenon to establish what follows what productively in the vocalized intervals of song. End quote. In singing a melody, what follows what is what tends to be conducive to the song, what makes it grow. Music arises in original vocalizations involving consecutive movement, but is not reducible to the consecutive comparison or intervals as if a mere relation or magnitude or number. Instead, the following of each note by another is something which involves the continuity of intentionality, an emotional or expressive consistency. A song implies the sustained effort to sing it, and an enduring attitude which ebbs and flows through consonance, dissonance, and resolution, tensions or relaxations. Quote, in singing, the voice seems to arrange its intervals and notes on a principle of continuity, synakia, observing a natural law, phusikein, of collocution, and not placing any interval at random after another, whether equal or unequal. These laws of collocution are like letters and syllables, and the melody implies an innate syntagmatic logic of relationality. Collocution is a linguistic term that refers to the habitual and conventional linking of certain words with other words. It's the inner nomos of linguistic expression, forming an expressive consistency. Just as active listening involves anticipation of the next word of the speaker, musical perception anticipates the next tone. Collocation operates on the phonic layer as well. Letters fit together to form a syllable. Just as we never place 3 consonants in a row, we will never place 3 diaces. In melody, only certain positions in the pattern of notes lend themselves to being followed by others in a melodic way. Modern musicians often make use of unmelodic musical sequences, a marvelous proof of Aristoxenus' phenomenological insights into the nature of musical perception. An unmelodic sequence continuously breaks the rules. And as it turns out, this is a much harder thing to do than to make something melodic, especially with the voice. The basic melodic order represented by the pentatonic and diatonic scales are uniformly given forms to humans everywhere across the earth for at least the last 10,000 years, but I suspect far longer. We will study these organizing patterns by singing many songs and learning what follows what in a natural way. And this will always be connected to the intent, attitude, and mood of the singer. The mode is not the mathematical structure, it is the style which permeates a fluid organization. Schoenberg also employed a linguistic analogy to describe developing variation. He preferred prose to verse. Verse remains tied to simple repetitions, a redundancy and monotony. It's hypnotic and rocks the cradle of our mind and dulls our attention. Variation keeps us moving and demands our presence. It awakens and calls forth a phenomenological alertness. But this is not cerebral as much as it is embodied and affects us almost entirely on the level of sensation. The duration of developing variation is marked by the perceptual advance into novelty and the unrepeatable quality of deep existential lived temporality. The transitory becomes evolutionary when some continuity is maintained, enough to keep it musical while nevertheless subverting every tendency to be redundant and monotonous, to remain stable within a single structuring reference point. We cannot fully habituate to this music. We cannot follow it mindlessly, nor does it tend to soothe us or rock us to sleep. It shows us, as Aristoxenus tried to show us, that a progressive deepening of musical form emerges from the radical freedom of melodiousness, of musical continuity more generally, to develop and form an organic whole without remaining tied to any system of pitches. Furthermore, it's best for the musician to develop a sense of attunement intuitively as an embodied know-how, and by means of training and tuning one's sensory motor system, one is then able to not only learn to follow melodic patterns, but to participate in their creation. Then they can devote themselves not only to playing them expressively, but also to composing melodies. Perhaps the nature of music is something very simple, which humans complicate and draw more out of than it contains by developing variation. Perhaps this simple and yet infinite potentiality is the metaphysical memory of the cosmos, a world soul that yearns everywhere to grow, strengthen, and evolve by harmonizing the multiplicity and contrariety into something with pattern and form. Rather than a muse that speaks down from heaven or a genius which is conceived as a sort of atemporal agency working in time, we have an all-pervasive potential energy that is actualized by performance and perception, and which makes possible highly complex patterns, as well as this ever-present potential for variation. This is a profound insight into nature itself, and I think Aristoxenus has himself harmonized the Pythagorean vocation with his more innovative approach, born out of peripatetic methodology and metaphysics. The dunamis of the notes is what appears contextually in the continuity, synakia, of the melody, which we know is also its energeia and even its entelikeia. The soul of the melody is its entelikeia, while the systema are like bodies having life potentially. The song is enacted, energeia, as a movement, kinesis. The life of music comes from the continuity and intentionality. Attunement and the nature of music is closer to a primordial, undifferentiated, embryonic potential and openness to the development of form. While Aristotle thought the human form did not evolve, projecting axial age social structures into eternal articulations of difference. Nevertheless, he did seem to think that anthropos was an incomplete form, and telecheia that develops and transforms. If we apply Aristoxenus' view of the nature of melody to the body having life potential, and furthermore to the growing strength and refinement of virtue, of character, of style, and friendship, then we must draw out new potentials for harmonizing ourselves in community. We must strive passionately to care for each other in the way musicians devote themselves to each other when they all try to put on the best possible performance, which almost always means being the most playful and joyful about it. No doubt, sad songs, laments, grieving and crying out in pain is very musical. All this is still immensely musically compelling. Here, it is also a bittersweet joy, one in which we grieve together, we feel each other's pain, we commiserate, and share a sense of spiritual connection. Musicians need to be friends with the sounds themselves and learn their behaviors, and then, out of love and respect, they nurture them and they do all they can to bring them up, to raise it and shape its becoming in a way that is in the best possible way, so that musical experience draws more out of the sounds than they contain. And I'll just end by saying that I don't think Plato could have endorsed the political position voiced by Socrates in the Republic. I don't think he wanted to outlaw Archytas music, nor the open modulations of Aristoxenus. I think we would do much better to reinterpret Plato in light of Archytas and Aristoxenus.